starting with the push for peace from several countries working on trying to end the conflict. Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey have now put together a ceasefire proposal, sending it off to the two warring parties overnight. Their plan calls for a 45-day pause in the fighting while working toward a comprehensive agreement. But a Persian Gulf diplomat with experience in recent negotiations with Iran tells MS Now that Iran's foreign minister is expected to reject the offer this morning as the countries appear to remain far apart. In a sign of that distance, President Trump continues to escalate his threats, writing in an expletive-laden social media post yesterday that the U.S. will strike Iranian power plants and other infrastructure unless the Strait of Hormuz is reopened by 8 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow night, meaning Tuesday. The president is set to speak from the White House on the war this afternoon, holding a news conference, we believe, in the briefing room at 1 o'clock. Meanwhile, the fighting continues this morning. Israel says it killed the head of intelligence for Iran's Revolutionary Guard and is vowing to keep going, with the Israeli defense minister pledging to hunt Iranian leaders down one by one. Also today, Israel attacked a key petrochemical plant at Iran's massive South Pars natural gas field, a site that is responsible for half of the country's petrochemical production. Quick note there, the last time Israel hit that facility is when Iran struck back, hitting the Qatar side of that facility, which prompted an alarmed post from President Trump saying that they would not strike energy infrastructure, at least for the time being. That may be changing. Our next guest is calling on the president to finish the job in Iran. In an opinion piece for the New York Times, former national security advisor during Trump's first term, John Bolton, outlines a series of steps for how he says the U.S. can still win this war. John Bolton joins us now. He also served as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations during the George W. Bush administration. Mr. Ambassador, good morning. Thank you for joining us. There's a lot to get to with the state of the conflict, but let's begin with your piece. President Trump has been criticized by many for being pretty murky and outlining the reasons for the conflict and the goals of the conflict. And certainly this war has not gone quite as he and the Pentagon have planned. But you're saying victory can still be achieved. Tell us how.
Well, I think the objective should be regime change, and I'm not sure that is Trump's objective. I thought it might have been at the beginning, but he's lost the bubble, to say the least, since then. The idea of regime change comes here from the regime fragmenting at the top, fragmenting because of the elimination of hundreds of its top leaders, because of the destruction that's been wreaked on the Revolutionary Guard, the Quds Force, the besieged militia, the instruments of state power that threaten us and our allies internationally and threaten the Iranian people at home. As the regime fractures at the top and splits develop, the regime becomes weaker and weaker, and people all over Iran can see basically it can't defend itself. And that in turn leads to the possibility that elements of the regime, in effect, come over to the side of the opposition, that the opposition begins to get stronger. It's not something that happens in one day, that's for sure. And it's not something that happens because opponents of the regime go out in the streets when they're still worried about the Revolutionary Guard's position. So this is going to take some time, but the most immediate point, obviously, is to open the Strait of Hormuz. I think we can do that. I think we're in the process of taking the military steps necessary. And I think that's something that we have to consider longer term. It's a further argument for regime change because the Ayatollahs and the Revolutionary Guard now see what happens when they close the strait, and that's a threat to the world economy. So like the nuclear threat, like the terrorism threat, the threat to close the strait is yet another justification to get rid of this regime.
So we had some expert analysis on this morning saying indeed that the focus should be on reopening the Strait of Hormuz. That should be what the military is working towards right now. But we saw from President Trump over the weekend his threat yet again to attack Iran's electrical infrastructure and the like. Tell us what you make of that threat, and if he follows through, what would that mean for the region?
Well, who knows whether he's going to follow through? I don't think even he knows he's going to follow through. I think that explains the language of the Easter morning Truth Social posting. The idea that he's extended his deadline yet again to tomorrow, I think says to whoever's in control in Tehran that he's not really serious about it. He's too nervous. He may make the threat, but he won't carry through on it. There is an argument that targets that in effect support the Iranian military, whether they supply power to civilian enterprises as well, are legitimate. And if you look at the scope of U.S. and Allied bombing of Germany and Japan in World War II, I think that's a pretty good demonstration of how that works. The Iranians, like Hamas, have spent an extraordinary amount of money building their war machine underground, leaving power for it above ground. And that is a vulnerability. But how much Trump will go after and how much of it's related to the military, I don't think anybody outside the government can tell at this point.
I mean, you just made a positive case for the possibility of those strikes. Others have said it might be a war crime if the president follows through. Let me ask you about the idea, Mr. Ambassador, of inserting ground troops into this conflict. Obviously, we did see a successful military operation over the weekend. They were able to rescue the downed airmen whose flight was shot down earlier in the weekend. But there's some talk of perhaps the Karg Island being a possible entry point. I reported last week the president considering also setting in special forces perhaps to seize Iran's uranium materials to prevent it from ever getting a weapon there. The risky operations, to be sure. Would you, if you were his national security advisor right now, would you be counseling him to do those missions or not?
Well, in terms of opening the Strait of Hormuz, what I would do would be to blockade it so that no Iranian oil is getting out, and so that everybody understands if Gulf Arab oil isn't going to get out, Iran isn't going to make money selling their oil, then to use the proceeds against our troops. I think that is the best application of our resources. But I do think there are islands in the Gulf, in the Strait, that are worth taking. For example, the United Arab Emirates claims 3 important islands, Greater Tunba, Lesser Tunba, and Abu Musa, that are currently held by Iran, and apparently are deeply fortified as part of what could be an effort to block the Strait. I think taking those islands and disabling their capabilities, and perhaps even turning that strategic difference back on Iran would be better, for example, than going after Karg Island.
Richard Haass, a friend of the show, of course, also floated that idea of a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, saying it's either open for all or closed for all. So in a new column for the National Review titled The Fog of War Against Iran, contributing editor Andrew McCarthy writes this, Mr. Ambassador, and we'll get your take. McCarthy writes, the problem with Trump's approach to war, which is the same as his approach to everything else, is his resistance to setting out clear objectives, explaining himself and marshaling allies before launching. These cut against the nature of a cunning man who has come miraculously far by a combination of audacity, always keeping his options open, and maintaining overconfidence in his gut instincts. Since the president did not amass support prior to striking, the public, broadly speaking, doesn't understand why it was necessary to strike. It doesn't know what we're trying to accomplish. When America loses a war, it is generally because of political reaction at home, notwithstanding smashing success on the battlefield. Winning is not just about achieving military goals. It entails selling the American people on critical national security aims and then unmistakably achieving them. If the president doesn't do that, a win can be made to look like a loss. Ambassador Bolton, do you think right now, though the president certainly was faltering at the start of this conflict, do you think, and we didn't hear it in his speech last week, is there still a chance that he could convince the American people why this conflict is, in his mind, necessary?
Well, there's a chance. I think the case for regime change in Iran is very compelling. I think if he had made the case in advance, and I don't mean just one speech from the Oval Office, I mean a broader campaign to build public support, to get sympathy in Congress, to work with our allies, and in particular, to work with and assist the opposition in Iran, would have made success far more likely. I don't think it's impossible now. That's why I wrote that piece. I think we still can achieve regime change. But every day the president tweets like he did yesterday morning, says to the figures in Tehran still in authority that they can wait him out because he's so worried that ultimately maybe Taco, Trump always chickens out, will benefit them too.
And Mr. Ambassador, lastly, you wrote on NATO recently as well, and I've done a piece on this as well. The Europeans are anxious. European leaders are anxious that this could be an inflection point for this alliance. President Trump, as we know, is angry that Europe has not helped, he thinks, in reopening the Strait of Hormuz. He already really strained the alliance back in January with his threats about Greenland. Now has openly mused, though we didn't hear from his speech the other night, but has openly mused about withdrawing from NATO, or, there are legal mechanisms that might stop that, but at least weakening NATO by moving troops around and the like. That would, of course, be Vladimir Putin's dream. What would your counsel be here to Europeans trying to manage this precarious moment?
Stop responding to Trump in kind. They don't like him so much that they're overlooking their own strategic interest. And the point about splitting NATO is key. They talk about being self-sufficient in defense. They're so far from it that it's almost laughable. That is what the Kremlin tried to do during the Cold War unsuccessfully. And one among many reasons why Russia lost the Cold War was they didn't split the Atlantic Alliance. Europeans have to grit their teeth, like a lot of Americans do, and try to withstand some of Trump's more inane ideas, because we need NATO and we will need it after he is gone even more.
All right. Former Trump National Security Advisor, Ambassador John Bolton. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for joining us this morning.